I want to invite Mr. Colm O'Comartun to come to the stage. I will say this about Colm, my friend, that I am lucky enough in my life to have worked with a lot of political figures, to have gotten to know a lot of political figures, both observers and actors, advisors. And there are few people in the country that I think as highly of when it comes to really true, careful insight, not hyperbolic insight, but very careful insight. Few people I know that are as good at this than Colm. So, sir, don't screw it up. Let's welcome him to the stage.
Well, thank you all very much for coming out this morning. This is a wonderful event. This is maybe my 8th or 9th State of Reform conference across the country. And I love it because it's the only conference that brings together all of the people involved in the healthcare system. Everywhere else, it's doctors talking to doctors, insurance companies talking to insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies talking to retailers. Nowhere do you have the right people at the right time in the right room talking about the right issues. So thank you all for coming today. You're what makes it special. Wow, this was an amazing year. This is how I felt at the end of my year. I got to say, between the will we win the Senate, will we lose the Senate, will we win the House, will we lose the House, as a Democratic political operative, there was intense pressure. We'd seen a lot of the writing on the wall, I think, in the previous 2 years, but we still didn't really know. Layer on that, the 24-hour news cycle, the caravan on our southern border, and I was ready for election night to be over. And then at 11 o'clock that night, they say now that the midterms are resolved, let's turn our attention to the presidential cycle. And the number one question there is, will Jay Inslee run for president? Well, now we know. This was a huge year. When I was down in San Diego with State of Reform just a few weeks ago, people were still asking, was it a wave election? Did Democrats do well? And I think there is absolutely no doubt that this was a huge, monumental win for Democrats this year. Just on the raw numbers, I think that we've got some truly once-in-a-lifetime numbers in many ways. We've got all the hallmarks of a wave. 53% of voters voted Democrat versus 45% who voted Republican. 10 million more people voted Democrat than voted Republican. The spread at 8.1% between the 53 and 45 is the greatest spread since Watergate, since 1974. In the previous 3 wave elections, the winner of the wave won 57% of the toss-up races for Congress. This year, Democrats won 57% of toss-up races. The fact that we don't get quite the impact as in previous races because of those huge numbers, those huge Democratic numbers, is partly because of the changes in gerrymandering or the redistricting that had happened in 2010 and the impact maybe of computer models that makes it more acute, more pronounced. I think we might see a change in that in the next 10 years. But for us, we have to ask ourselves, what does that all mean? You know, I think that one of the most important parts of this election was the cause of it, turnout. We got such engagement. We didn't know that we would have the biggest turnout in 100 years, although for the previous 2 years, we saw some indications, starting with Ralph Northam's election in Virginia for governor, where we saw this huge surge of voters coming out and voting Democrat from the suburbs in what is traditionally viewed as a swing state. And when they came out, women were a huge factor. Healthcare was a huge issue. So we had no idea if this was a once-off or if this was just a reaction to the presidential election. Now, we did see big surges in Democratic turnout over the next 2 years in special elections in states where Democrats actually won nearly 50 state special elections in a row, including in in Washington State. In fact, in Washington State, we saw voter turnout, the second biggest voter turnout in midterms ever. 72% of registered voters returned their ballot. That was a huge driver of change this year. Why did voters turn out? I think this is what's driving the huge turnout. Voters are mad. Voters are madder than usual. I mean, voters have thought the country was headed in the wrong direction for the last 25 years. And in that 25 years, what they have experienced personally is concern about healthcare costs, concern about third-level costs, concern about stagnant wages, that kid who's living in the basement. And they feel that their world is changing around them. We're living in a period of intense change. Global, economic, generational, demographic, and the institutions are not keeping up with the concerns of the voters. This man's also driving the conversation. There isn't a politician who has dominated the conversation maybe since Nixon, and certainly this era seems more like the Vietnam era for just the complete consumption of the news cycle by one person or one set of issues. But he is driving people to vote, to feel he's preying on their natural concern and angst and anger, and he is single-handedly making people talk about the things he wants to talk about. That caravan on the southern border, just before the last election, and then no mention of it after, is just a classic example of how he has got complete control of the news cycle and of the media. I mean, the media showed the president's immigration speech on all national networks this week, and point-blank refused Barack Obama's request to speak to the nation on immigration just a few years before. This man won 84% of every county in the United States. What he capitalizes on that's driving turnout and driving our political conversation is that, the anger in the United States that we can all feel has changed a little bit. Traditionally, people do get angry with other people's positions. They get angry with the head of other political parties. They get angry with other people's parties' presidential nomination. But that anger with their positions has changed to moral indignation and has changed to anger with them. And that has the potential, if not satisfied in some way with dramatic change, to turn into a desire for revenge. And I think we're starting to see that portrayed in deep polarization, and it's connecting with tribal politics, which is dramatically influencing our institutions. This is the 6th change election in the last 7 elections, and it is the 4th change election in midterms in a row. You can feel the nature of our politics changing because everybody has such extreme positions on the president. 31% strongly approve of the president. 46% strongly disapprove, driving the turnout. And maybe people turned out because of governor's elections, maybe they turned out because of ballot initiatives. Well, 33% of them did, but the rest turned out to either support Trump or oppose Trump. Trump has truly turned the Republican Party into his party. The problem for the Republican Party, and I think the reason I'd like to dwell a little bit on the impact of all of this is because Donald Trump's approval number has never gotten above 45%. And so while he has a deep grip on those who portray themselves as conservative Republicans, those self-identified group is declining. And what we see is that when you've less than a 50% approval rating heading into election day and a midterm, you lose on average 50 seats in the House, and that's exactly what we saw. This chart here, I think, is one that outlines some of the real concern that the Republican Party should have in the next few years. Now, really, we're here today to think a little, as we look at these numbers, about, is this just a blip? Is this just a temporary change? Or is this a realignment in American politics? But what we see is that in the 4 major groups of voters, gender, age, education, and ethnicity, that the Republican Party is falling behind in each one. Obviously, women drove the outcomes in this election. We know that. We'd seen it in the last 2 years. We didn't know if it would manifest fully in the midterms elections, but it did. They voted Democrat by 59 to 40%. 2 years ago, that was a 4-point spread. Now it's a 19-point spread. And even in the lines that do show the red line above the blue line, it's not by much. And when it is, in the 65 plus category, women still voted Democrat, 53% of them. This is an alarming chart, I think, for the Republican Party. And again, we break it out in gender, age, race, and education, because truly you can now delineate our national politics not by an economic cleavage, but by a education cleavage, by a racial cleavage, and now by an urban-rural cleavage. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's look at the alarming numbers on this chart for the Republican Party. On the right-hand column, the 2014 column, on the left-hand column, the 2018 column. Democrats won 53% of the 52%. So 53%, I'm sorry, they won 59%. If in 2018 you see that women voted Democrat versus Republican by 59 to 40%, and women made up 53% of the electorate. So now you're winning 59% of 53% of the electorate. That's a very powerful number. Democrats are winning young people, of course, and they're winning every ethnic group. But in here, you've got some real problems for the Republican Party, because if we just have a quick look to George Bush's numbers, you can see that, as we all understand, Latinos are not inherently Democratic voters. They're small business people. They are more Christian. They are more conservative and more religious than non-Latino Americans. 44% of them voted for George W. Bush. And if we see Asians, 43% of Asians voted for George W. Bush. 48% of women voted for George W. Bush. If we go back, we'll see the most alarming number here, I think, is that 50% of Latinos, 50% of Asians voted Republican 4 years ago, and now 77% of them vote Democrat. The biggest alarming number, I think, though, for Republicans is that there's a deep concern in the Democratic Party that Latinos don't turn out. Latinos are 17% of the population, but traditionally only 8% of them vote. This year, 11% of them voted, and Republicans lost ground with Latinos. So, some big demographic changes on the horizon. I mean, let's consider the other alarming number on this chart, and we won't spend too long on this chart, but I think it's the story of the election, and it could be the story of the future for the two parties if some of these become norms. An unbelievable number, when you imagine it, is that 91% of the electorate was white in 1990. 4 years ago, 75% of the electorate was white. This year, 72% of the electorate is white. How much more doubling down can the Republican Party do on older white Americans? In 2040, 50% of the country will be non-white. The bedrock of the Republican Party in this country has been the suburbs for the last 30, 40 years, since 1968. This year, Democrats obviously dominate in the urban areas, and Republicans dominate in the small town rural areas, but Republicans have thrived in the suburbs until this cycle. Democrats were able to hold them 49-49 in a broad suburban definition. They break it out a little bit differently here. And we dominate the coasts. Going back to 84% of counties in America voted for Donald Trump. That's not where Americans live. Americans live on the coasts. Now, I think that there's something a little bit dangerous for a party like the Democratic Party that doesn't have widespread appeal and doesn't want widespread appeal. You must appeal. Morally, it's imperative that you've got something for every American and that you want to reach out to every American no matter where they live and offer them solutions for their life problems. But realistically, we have to acknowledge that for the future, more Democrats from California in the United States House than came from 34 other states combined. So if you had to choose, the Democratic position is still a better position than the Republican position, except for one thing that could lead to a constitutional crisis in the United States is, look at that big empty space in the middle. Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho. They may not send many members to Congress, but they send 2 US senators to the US Senate. New York sends 2, California sends 2, and all these empty states in the middle, they all send 2. And they're becoming more and more Republican, which is, I think, going to create a long-term problem of disassociation for our body politic. We can talk about that a little bit later, maybe. The good news for everybody in this room is that, as we saw way back for Ralph Northam's election in Virginia, the number one issue in America today is not taxes, not jobs, not the economy, as it has been for the last 15 to 20 years. It's healthcare. And you can be sure that Republicans thought that they could make it about taxes, that they could make it about tax cuts. They didn't. And the wonderful news for the first time in my own excruciating political career is that we didn't take the bait, as we do so often, and we didn't talk about what Donald Trump wanted to talk about or what Republicans wanted to talk about, and Democrats talked about health care, and they didn't talk about taxes. It's not always about the economy, stupid, and turnout is driven by anger, and people have no longer expressed anger at this economy, and they accept that this economy is good, even though many of them feel their own personal economy is not good. And I wonder if Donald Trump will start to run into the same problem Barack Obama had when he started to talk about our economy is turned around, our economy is doing well, but people didn't feel it, and so they resented it. But for now in this election, it's not about the economy. People acknowledge that it's good, and they still didn't vote for the party that they think, based on this number, does a better job on the economy, the Republican Party. How did Democrats eventually get it right? Well, remember this group of people, the women with the pussy hats and the big numbers and the march? Well, they, for the first time, have actually gotten to a place where they've got the right number of candidates. They know they've got the control of the money, they've got control of the agenda, they've got control of the conversation within the party. The face of the resistance in America is not a 22-year-old person of color on the barricades. It's the librarian, the middle-aged female librarian in your community, in your neighborhood. She's active, she's vocal, and women are feeling their power, and they're voting Democrat, and they're now represented in Congress. 100 women went to Congress in the last week. College moms are the new soccer moms. And the Republican Party is losing not just a larger group of voters than men represent within the electorate, but I think that the suburban change is a sign that these women are pulling the men in their lives with them. They have huge influence on their families. Just like we sometimes struggle to understand why married women have traditionally voted Republican, and some people in the Democratic Party, I think, erroneously say they vote against their self-interest, but they vote for what's best for their family. Now I think we're seeing some men in the suburbs who are being pulled over by the women in their lives who have traditionally voted Republican because they're being persuaded that this is what's best for their family. Women without children have consistently voted Democrat, but mothers have not voted in these numbers until this election. And of course, as we see, education is the biggest determinant of whether you're going to vote Republican or Democrat in the current environment. We also got the money right for the first time ever. Democrats raised more money and spent more money in this midterm election than they had before. And that little green box on the right-hand side, it's interesting, you may have seen Nancy Pelosi talk about where one of the first things on the agenda for the new Congress is going to bring transparency to political fundraising, and that's to have a look at what's inside that green box, because Democrats suspect that that's where the big corporate money is going. We want to have a look inside that. But for now, we've actually figured out how to raise and spend as much money. And small dollar money is moving around the country, allowing people like Beto O'Rourke to raise a huge amount of money from Democrats right around the country. Stacey Abrams, Gillum. If you can catch fire on the internet, you can raise more money than the big corporate interests can put in against you from small dollar donations right across the country. And that's not going to change. That's not going to go away, which is good news for the Democratic Party. We also had, for the first time, a slate of candidates in more places than we've ever had them before. Again, learning from that Ralph Northam experience, which is if there's a wave and you don't have a candidate there to capitalize on it, well, then you can't win that seat. So more people in more races and more people who look like they're voters, because I don't think that Crowley and Capuano were voted out because they were bad politicians or because they didn't represent the views of their voters. But at a certain point, voters want the people who represent them to look like them. And that benefited the Crowleys and the Capuanos, Irish and Italians, in the neighborhoods that they were in when the Yankees were pushed out in favor of the Irish, Italians, Germans, and other ethnic groups. And now it's the turn of those new faces in America to be represented by people who look like them. Our candidates were very good. We didn't end up with a slate of people who didn't feel like a good fit for their communities, extremists, or people who represented a national conversation that wasn't a good fit in Kansas or wasn't a good fit in Nevada. And I think that the slate of governors, for example, that has just been elected is a very moderate, very good fit for the states they come from. Laura Kelly up there couldn't have been elected in Kansas if she was a Washington Democrat, Nancy Pelosi, San Francisco liberal. And so we just did a good job on that. And all of the hand-wringing about will we nominate a whole group of unelectable progressives, left-wingers and socialists didn't come to pass. In state elections, we'll zip through here. You were a canary in the mine shaft here in Washington State. You were one of those special elections that made a difference and changed the nature of your House, Senate, and governorship to become a trifecta. Last year you did that. We saw that right across the country. This time, where we went from 15 Democratic governors to 23 Democratic governors in the last 2 years. I hear DJ turn to the person beside him and say, all they needed was better leadership over at the DGA. Might be true. I led that for the previous loss-making 4 years. But here's why this matters, and it matters a great deal. The reason why the Democrats put together a committee just to win Democratic governorships across the country in this cycle, in this midterms, was because of redistricting. Democrats are underrepresented based on their vote, both in House and Senate in states, as well as in Congress, because of the 2010 redistricting outcomes. And the more governorships and the more state legislatures we control in 2020, the more we'll be able to shape reapportionment going forward. I think it was also very important for us to rebuild back some confidence that we can win in the Rocky Mountains, in New Mexico, and now in Colorado. That's a good wall. We need to. When I started in gubernatorial politics, I remember Governor Freudenthal from Wyoming was a Democrat. And we're showing that we can win in these states. We can win in Kansas. We can win in deep red states. You know, we almost won in Georgia by having a fabulous candidate and having the resources behind that candidate that we needed. So we can win in these states. Again, in a place like Georgia, Atlanta, Oklahoma City. These are the places that the suburban vote is hugely important on. But Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, we can win in the Rust Belt again. There was such anxiety, such concern that the Midwest was going to go the way of the South, and that we were going to lose those white, ethnic, Rust Belt voters on the Iron Range in Minnesota, but we didn't. We had a very good election cycle. It shows that we can win. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and these are also presidential swing states. So across the board, really great news for us this year. In a sign of the polarization and partisanship and tribalism that is, again, linked to that anger, and what we see here is that for the first time in 100 years, we have only one split chamber in our legislatures across the country. This, I think, has profound consequences. If we look at the trifectas, parties that control governors, state senates, and state houses, we see more and more trifectas, including Washington State, 23 Republican, 14 Democrat. That means you can really drive home your policy agenda. There's the change. Just in the last cycle, Democrats got a lot more trifectas. But I think in an issue that is not helpful to some extent, and the voters won't particularly love long-term, is the trifectas that have a supermajority. Governor John Hickenlooper of Colorado is often held up to be a great moderate governor. Well, Governor John Hickenlooper, let's look at some other moderate success governors across the country. Baker in Massachusetts, a Republican. Larry Hogan in Maryland. One of the features is that they've got legislatures that are of the opposite party. John Hickenlooper had a split legislature that didn't send him uber progressive legislation. He didn't have to make those really tough decisions. And so he could look like that moderate. Jared Polis, there's a frame out there that Jared Polis and Gavin Newsom are, super progressive lefties. Well, whether they are or not, and I think they're actually not, they're going to be given a raft of progressive legislation that their previous governors didn't get, and they can't even vote against it because it can be overturned by the legislature, so they may as well sign it, and that'll cement their legacy as uber-progressive lefties that move the state to the left. But it's these supermajorities that I think are going to have a tremendous influence on what can be done in the state. A lot of good stuff will be done. Some stuff that maybe the voters will feel is going too far will also be done, and the governor won't necessarily be able to stop it. Healthcare. Well, great news out of the midterms was that we got some clarity that the Affordable Care Act is actually not deeply unpopular around the country, as we were gleaning for the two previous years since the presidential election. In fact, people who want to expand the law, 34%, outweigh the people who want to repeal the law at 25%. And also the midterms brought the continued push to expand Medicaid across the country, which I would contend is one of the greatest impacts of the Affordable Care Act and has the greatest impact on actual lives covered in the United States as far as state government is concerned. Look at these conservative states that are voting to expand Medicaid. And actually, we also elected a Democratic governor in Maine that had previously passed a ballot initiative to expand Medicaid, so that will come in Maine. And look what's left. It's starting to look like ideologically driven Deep South and some other states, but a betting man would say this map is going to slowly but surely turn blue in the next 10 years. What does all of this mean for the future? One thing that's a little scary is that Supreme Court decision that I'm sure you all will spend a lot of time talking about today that puts the Affordable Care Act in jeopardy. And we'll see, we can see the kind of roadmap for how that's going to play out. But meanwhile, I think we will see a Democratic House be pretty aggressive to rally the base with some popular initiatives, try and do some deals to help the members get reelected in 2 years' time, which is do a deal with the administration on infrastructure, on trade. President may not understand it, but he hasn't actually passed his second version of NAFTA. He has only lined it up to be passed by the House, and so there will be another standoff in relation to that, which has the potential for Democrats to get a lot of concessions from the president. And then, of course, we'll do some base building by stopping and reversing some of the things that went on in the first 2 years of the administration. But I think also we've seen a change. The public is really starting to feel it has the potential to change, and with greater engagement comes greater outcomes, and ballot initiatives are growing in importance and in number right across the country. And from a democratic perspective, they will be mainly led by voting rights, some privacy issues, some healthcare issues, expanding Medicaid, and I think guns are going to become slowly but surely a part of that national conversation, as a younger generation is no longer willing to allow the gun debate to be controlled by a small group of people. In Washington State, you had a very lively and much watched ballot initiative season, although I would notice from my own perspective that it seemed like big money in the ballot initiative process got what it wanted in the two ballot initiatives that it really cared about, when it came to the cap and trade, and when it came to the grocery tax, which is really a soda tax bill. The big corporate interests were able to spend unlimited amounts of money and able to get the result that they wanted. And I sometimes worry about the ballot initiative process, that it's driven by consultants and that whoever has the most money is able to shape the outcome. But it can suck a lot of oxygen out of the air. But it's coming right across the country. You know, another consequence of the problems in Washington is just, I think, more executive action at state level on these issues that I think people, I know we're already talking about them: drug prices, protecting the Affordable Care Act. The legislature in Maine just said its number one issue for the upcoming session will be passing legislation to protect the Affordable Care Act in Maine. I think you'll see more activists joining with big, more powerful NGOs due to frustration with government. Presidential year is upon us, much and all as I'm exhausted at the thought of it, but it is upon us, and there's some big issues in play with the presidential election. One, Democrats no longer will have winner-take-all primary states. And the winner-take-all primary states is what weeded out people after New Hampshire and Iowa. After those first two states, the field narrows dramatically. Maybe not if you're somebody who feels like they can come away from California with a proportion of those delegates. And California has now moved up to be the 5th state in the election cycle, giving it enormous influence and power, and encouraging people who can raise any amount of money to hang on until California. And there are no superdelegates, which leads to the concept of a brokered convention. A cast of thousands, an embarrassment of riches for the Democratic Party heading into this presidential election. My business partner ran the RGA, and I said, as we looked at the amount of Republican governors who were looking to run the last time, I said, it's an embarrassment of riches. And he said, it's certainly an embarrassment of ambition. But we have a lot of diversity, political diversity, economic outcome diversity, and physical diversity on offer. Right now, it's impossible to tell, I think, how things are going to shake out. But already we're seeing people, I think, with a field so big, many people on the field are calling their go-to donors who are saying that we can't support you right now because I've got my eye on somebody else on that big giant screen. And that's already making some people drop out. Martin O'Malley dropped out this week, and just yesterday we saw somebody else dropped out. I expect that as the reality of limited resources and too many people, but it will be an extraordinary situation as the DNC, after the mistakes of the last cycle, has said it'll give everybody a hearing. It'll allow all these people to participate in conversations and in debate, and I think that's all for the good. But right now, if you look at these poll numbers, it's all about name recognition. So Joe Biden, number one across the board in every one of these. In every one of these polls, but people are already expressing some need for generational change by saying that they'd be most excited about somebody entirely new who's not on the list at all. I personally think that one of the things that'll happen this time, if there's any sense of a brokered convention, and I think there might be, is that because the primary will have energy from women and from the left, and Trump will be running against the Pelosi House, I think that you might see the need to pair off before you go to the convention. I find it impossible to believe that the convention will be smooth sailing for that old white man who goes in without giving any indication as to who he's going to run against. So I think you'll see, if it's a white male at the top of the ticket, they will have to be paired off early with the Kamala Harrises, the Cory Bookers, or the Elizabeth Warrens, or somebody of color, or somebody of a different. There's no doubt that an all-white male ticket is not going to be the Democratic ticket going forward. Who knows, maybe it's time for the hometown hero, for somebody completely different to take the stage. Either way, I can't wait for the 2020 election cycle, and it's already upon us. Thank you all very much for your time today, and I think we might have time for a couple of questions.
Jumping ahead through many of the things you talked about now, the idea of anger in the Democratic Party, some sort of backlash, this idea that the sort of hollowing out, sadly, of rural America may create a constitutional crisis in terms of a lot of states with few people having equal weight in the Senate, limiting action. And you said, well, that all just, and I said, well, we can't figure out how to fix that constitutionally because I think it leads to some extra constitutional action. And you said, oh, we'll just have a Trump from the left, and he'll just write executive orders. He'll just do it. And I thought, oh my God, I hadn't even thought really of what a president on the left would do. Share more of your thinking about a Trump from the left and what that would mean.
If we went back to our conversation about demographic change and generational change, and we pictured a time 20 years from now where the white Americans are in a minority, where the generational change has led to a much more progressive electorate, and yet we have a conservative US Senate that is packed with Republicans from the middle of the country, and they may even have 60 votes, and you've got a Supreme Court that is the legacy court from now, which has a even larger majority of Republican conservatives than we have now. In 20 years' time, these guys are so young that they will have complete sway. You've got institutions of government that are completely out of sync with where the country is. You could have a Senate passing anti-abortion bills backed by the Supreme Court that are representing 30% of the electorate. At that point, I think anger would dictate that the only solution you can do is to put in a president who's going to counterbalance that. And we were, for all that talk about the dictatorship of Barack Obama and his use of executive orders under the previous Republican legislature or Congress, Barack Obama was one of the most establishment-oriented presidents we've had in the last 50 years. If you had a Trump-like Democrat who used executive orders, declared national emergencies, packed the Supreme Court, and rode roughshod over the Senate, I think it's very easy to see that as being popular in the country.
Sounds like FDR,
exactly,
who we herald now, right? Or some do.
Although FDR had a complete course correction, because while we look back fondly on FDR, his natural inclinations led him to have a massive course correction, and a response to populism.
So let me ask you this also. I didn't mention this. You mentioned Martin O'Malley, but you come out of the Martin O'Malley camp, worked for him, you were active on his presidential campaign. Many people forget that there were more than Bernie and Hillary.
Be kind.
I thought he did a great job, but he couldn't get any airtime on the debates. He couldn't there was not room for him at the end, so to speak. What advice do you give to candidates who have 1% on the polls?
Of which there are many, many.
How do you stand out? And do you have to go to the far extreme? Do you have to learn from Donald Trump, which is to say the most outrageous things in order to get enough attention to elevate?
So, I mean, the good news for any candidate that is participating in this election cycle is that the rules have changed. You remember when Martin O'Malley ran, the fix was in. It really was. The DNC limited the debates. They literally had debates at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night during a football championship game. They did not want to see any outcome other than the predetermined outcome. And changing those rules makes it a much more favorable place for that broad spectrum of candidates who are now on 1%, but that's only because I think there's a couple of behemoth name recognition characters at the top. But I do think when you've got 20 people involved in a debate, first of all, there are some clear, distinct lanes, and
even with 20 people?
There are the moderates in the middle. There are going to be your left wing. They're going to be the establishment folks. I mean, on that chart up there, I think the establishment person who wrote an op-ed this weekend is going to get in is going to be Terry McAuliffe. He will be the older white man with the most establishment role. On the left, you'll see the Cory Bookers, figure out where the energy is on the left, and then in the middle you'll have those Governor Hickenloopers, Governor Inslees, and I think Inslee has a real lane carved out for himself because he's a single issue candidate on climate change, and I think that's going to give him some meat to talk about, something that will allow him to stand out. He has been polishing, literally you can see it in the last couple of years, his one-liners and his zingers. He's genuinely funny and he works hard on it. And so I think he is trying to stand out because you'll have to have personality on that stage. I think McAuliffe will do pretty well on that stage because I think he actually has a big enough personality to stand out. But for the Hickenloopers of the world, I think they're all going to be lost. So, the Landrews, the Hickenloopers, they may have a good record, but Martin O'Malley had the best record of anybody. He probably would have made the best manager and the most competent candidate, but that's not what the public wants.
Did I hear you just say that you're a Terry McAuliffe backer?
You know, I think that McAuliffe has the potential to do very well on that stage. He has the potential to look like somebody who has the personality to stand up to Trump, because at some point people are going to have to remember that that's who the other person on that stage is going to be, somebody who can suck the oxygen out of the room and dominate a conversation. And so the meek but smart person will maybe make a great president, but can they compete for airtime with the president, who's so skilled as a communications person? I will say that, as I thought about that meek person, and Elizabeth Warren came to mind, I will say about Warren is that she's got, even though she's an older white person, I mean, she's got a broad array of things that she truly believes in that makes her feel authentic in the way that Bernie Sanders did. She knows why she's there and what she's going to talk about. Some of the other folks would like to be president of the United States. And so what are you for? I'm for winning. What are you against? I'm against losing, right? But I think there are some folks like Warren who they really understand exactly what they're for, and they're going to be able to build a good relationship with the voters based on that.
Good. Colm O'Comartun, the principal at 50 State, former executive director of the Democratic Governors Association. Thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause.